manager for the Maya Foundation and Sydney Maya Fund, and have a couple of other projects on the side. Welcome to our panellists. Peter Evans, who is the co-artistic director of the Bell Shakespeare Company. Brenna Hobson, general manager of Belvoir. Matt Lutton, associate director, brackets direction, multifaceted.
Artist, brackets direction.
So many ways to say the same thing. Leticia Caceres. We had other things to rehearse other than names. I'm so sorry. And your title is Associate Director, MGC. Great, got that right. Yes. Wesley Enoch, Artistic Director of the Queensland Theatre Company. Geordie Brookman, Artistic Director at State Theatre Company, South Australia. Well, do we still say that? State Theatre, South Australia. Rowe, Literary Manager of the Sydney Theatre Company, and Mike Finch, Artistic Director of Circus Oz. Welcome very much to this session. It would be impossible not to acknowledge the very deep resonances of the previous session. Sometimes it is exceedingly important to be stilled by a conversation, and I can certainly say that I was. Stillness allows for resonance. Resonance continues and endures. What is equally important is that stillness does not stop conversation. So while the conversation we're about to have might take new pathways, the pathways that are very much alive in my mind from the previous conversations will both inform it, but not entirely take it over, because that would be inappropriate. I do understand that there will be an opportunity to continue that conversation over the lunch period in the foyer. It's interesting because all of the sessions I've been to while I've been here have been very striking, and there have been some incredibly compelling speakers, beginning in fact with Robin Archer's declaration about pathways to inspiration for the rest of your life, which I thought was a wonderful thing to be reminded of. Lenore and Kristen's wonderfully instructing conversation, talking to us about imagined futures and taking control of the steering wheel, remembering that agency and pathway equal hope. And then at tipping points yesterday, Christine Milne actually was astonishing and gave a fantastic kind of call to arms to the arts. She made the point that knowledge, information and fact had actually not gotten us very far for the last 20 years, but that emotion and connection to fact will. And she presented a really compelling case to the arts, and I fully respect the conversation also that's being had around issues of motivation and impulse, that we often share both the desire for social change, but also the desire for exploration of the form that we have made our own, that we've dedicated our lives to, being theatre. And that sometimes we do them at the same time and sometimes we don't, and there's no need to apologise for that, certainly not in my view. She also told a really interesting story about the need for a song for the, not so much for the Greens movement, but for the idea of positive change and being the architect of that change. And she told a story about how in the 70s, Here Comes the Sun was a song that would often be sung on marches, whether it was a May Day rally or whether it was an anti-nuclear march or whatever it was, or in fact for gender equality or in any of the issues of the day. And it's not possible to actually sing that song anymore for copyright reasons. And well, in the sense that you can't just play it over a speech. So the need and the call to arms was to also write a song. So I throw that out there to the composers among you. I actually then thought, well, maybe the conversation we have to have is with Gautier, because Gautier seems to be the musician that politicians like to actually own. If they own Gautier, they might have to own the lyrics and therefore own the message. So that was an interesting way forward as well. The other story that was told, and I'll keep this brief, was that during the Tunisian overthrow of the previous regime, just a couple of years ago as part of the Arab Spring, the people who had done the overthrowing were not necessarily to be trusted by the community at large any more than the regime that had been overthrown. But in order to verify their credibility and that their intentions were good, what they did was they ran a radio station's 24-hour broadcasting by pretending that it was a year on from the revolution itself. And what they did was they broadcast the future in the present. And they actually broadcast to the Tunisian people what it was their intentions were and what they hoped to achieve, which I thought was a brilliant strategy. And I'm wondering if we can't do that today with our fine colleagues from the major performing arts companies. And I would like to start, in fact, with Geordie Brookman, because Geordie has, one of the things that we're interested in talking about is what have we inherited when we inherit leadership of a state theatre company or a national touring company such as Bill Shakespeare or an international touring company such as Circus Oz. What is it that we inherit? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the branding? Is it the dedication to form? Is it the political currency? Or is it actually something much more malleable than that we can actually truly make our own moving forward? What are the impediments and what are the opportunities? Geordie, would you like to talk about your experience?
Yeah, so for those of you who I haven't met, I've been in the job at State Theatre since approximately May last year, purely in a programming capacity last year, and then kind of coming online properly as of January, which is maybe an experience. Wesley can talk a bit more about that later, about the strange process of coming into a company, taking the audience through your predecessor's program, and then actually beginning. It's like you have two beginnings when you come into these roles. I came into the company, I suppose I can say simply enough, my agenda was to try and create a creatively brave and ambitious company that had continuing relationships with artists, so that engaged with artists over a series of years and projects as opposed to on one-off instances, and a company that was deeply connected both to its community but also to its colleagues nationally and internationally. I know that sounds like a dot point from a job application, but it's the best way I had of tying it together. These ambitions, you know, as small and large as they are, get defined and I suppose refracted through the situation that you walk into, and you know, it's fairly open knowledge. And I came in as part of an executive team. I came into the company alongside our CEO Rob Brookman, and we walked into a company in a fragile situation, and a certain amount of stabilisation and rebuilding has had to occur and has to continue to occur before we can. Well, I wouldn't say before we can spread our wings. I think we're spreading our wings this year, and I think we're going in a really exciting direction. But growth gets inhibited by the necessary measures you have to take to stabilise a very large organisation sometimes, and that was certainly the situation that we came into. Our attitude at State Theatre was that you cannot shrink or cut your way out of trouble. You can only create your way out of trouble. And so our immediate approach was to, on the one hand, to re-engage nationally, so to try and start collaborating much more heavily with our colleagues interstate. And I do quite intentionally say collaborating, I don't just mean bringing work in. And to get a deep and short, medium and long-term creative development and new work program underway. I think one of the hardest things and one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn is every project requires its own timeline and its own process. There is no cookie cutter, there is no sausage factory. Every single show requires its own process and its own approach to development. And so you can commission something saying, yep, we'll aim for this to be on stage next year. But that project might take 3 years and then another one might be ready in 6 months. So I suppose our solution with this was to try and start to generate work from a wide number of sources, so a wide number of playwrights, to start engaging with independent companies and makers as well as playwrights, and to progress from there. I suppose the other challenge was that we came in with a fairly disenchanted core audience, and so a big part of the exercise has been about building trust. And we, I think, at its best, theatre is its community storyteller. It's the place that we go to tell each other about ourselves, and if that trust isn't there with your audience, if that trust to tell those stories well and to do it properly and to transport people, I think theatre has to transport. If that trust isn't there, then you're up against it. And so part of the process for us has been rebuilding trust.
Thanks, Geordie. Wesley, would you like to talk about your experience at Queensland Theatre Company?
Hello. As Geordie was saying, you come in, you inherit a program that's from your predecessor, and it's always interesting because we had a major flood year in that year, and so a major deficit year, which is actually fantastic when you have your first year and you can say, look how much growth we've had. There's something about creating narratives that I think is the biggest idea, and festival directors do it all the time. They say we broke box office records this year, and there's all these narratives around success. And it's that sense of how, as an incoming artistic director, you don't want to suppress or burden the outgoing director's program. You want to make sure that's as alive as it can be. But you want to create the narratives of connection, new audiences, and all that stuff, which is what I tried to do as well. I mean, it's hard to believe that anyone up here was once a freelance artist, and yet we all were. We were in exactly the same situations every freelance artist was in, and that the kind of vision and drive that made us freelance artists is why we are now in charge of these companies. And that the act of being in charge of these companies is that we are trying to shift, change, to allow that company to reflect the personality and the aesthetic drive of that artist. And I think that there's some structures now, and I've got personal kind of things around MTC with Brett's appointment going, what does that mean? What does it mean? How does an artistic director stamp the aesthetic if they're not making the work? Is that something that we're going to see? Is it like what art centres are doing, where there's a programming department, and how do they stamp the aesthetic? It's not saying it's a better or worse, but it's saying how does it happen? And
Wesley, expressively, that's a multi-headed artistic driver. It's not singularly artistic director. I mean, there are teams of artists working in your company. And in fact, all of the companies, in fact, more than ever before.
But I think the connection with an audience is through the artistic work that a key artist can make. And that's something that we have to look at. Because I think the discussion around the move from the supply argument to the demand argument has created a world where producers in these producing companies have become incredibly kind of powerful and thoughtful. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just saying it's another thing to take into account. And how do we look as practicing artists, how do we look at making sure that these large companies can reflect an aesthetic, a drive, an artistic vision in the process. Sometimes it's through conversation, sometimes it's just through pushing something to happen.
Is one of the things that you're doing actually finding a way to articulate the experience over the act of consumption, purchase of a ticket, for instance?
You'll have to explain that question to me.
Well, rather than selling tickets to shows, what we're actually doing is creating experiences and wanting audiences to engage. And so there is an act of participation sitting quietly in the dark, in my view. I don't think that participatory theatre has to always reach out and ask the audience to be a member.
It's interesting, I was talking to the finance manager about this 3 weeks ago, and saying, because there was this whole thing, and she was saying, our core business is selling tickets. And and I say this, of course it is. But actually our core business is making theatre. And that there is this discussion that happens, and what's great is when I talk about this, we go back and forth. But that's our job. That's why we get funded, that's why we make what we make. And that there are all the compromises that come into that too, and that it's best that an artist is there to help make that happen. That's my personal judgment.
So, Sorry, Wesley, I was just going to ask Leticia to respond.
Hi everyone, my name is Leticia Caceres. I'm the Associate Director at Melbourne Theatre Company, and I've been in the,
Sorry, just pass one of those mics up so that somebody can...
And I've been in the job for just under 6 months. So, you know, my insight into the company is not as extensive as I would like, you know, but it's getting there, and I'm spending lots of time with Brett, and I guess what I can say about making a stand is that Brett is, I think he, and I'm Argentinian, and he outpassions me, you know, when it comes to the arts. He's extraordinarily enthusiastic, and his devotion to theatre and the power that theatre has and the power of storytelling, it floors me, and it's incredibly exciting. That's not to say that it's not the same for you, but I would say that that you're not just as passionate, but what I would say is that his vision is quite eclectic, and that's, to me, incredibly exciting, because it kind of opens up the conversation, the possibilities, the form, the spaces, the kind of artists that we're working with. And
can you say, sorry, necessarily that's a bad thing. I guess
it's a good thing.
It's fantastic. But is a major producing company the best place for that to be? Are art centres and festivals very strong advocates in that way already?
Yes. No, they're not. They're not. I don't think they are. I've always felt that state theatre companies should be at the forefront, at the cutting edge of theatre making. I'm not necessarily saying that that's what is happening right now, but it may in a couple of years' time if you give us a little bit.
I guess my argument is about a unique offering. If a state theatre company is to be what it is to be, it's what's unique.
What is it to be?
Well, let's talk about that. But in the sense of saying, I think there is an incredible blurring of the lines between what art centres, what festivals, and now what state theatre companies are doing.
So Wesley, are you actually saying that there are a limited number of opportunities and therefore they should be sequestered to...
I think that it's about what is the unique offering that's
Okay,
possible.
I can answer that. I think the unique offering of Melbourne Theatre Company at the moment is story, where we are committed to telling stories, and through characters, through language, through plays, you know, and we are not ashamed of that at all. We have employed a literary manager that hasn't happened since I think 2006, and that was relatively informal. That to me is a statement about where we place the art of...
It's untrue. It's untrue.
Okay.
You're stepping all over Julian Merrick and Aidan Fennessy's
Julian Merrick.
And then Aidan Fennessy was after that. No, 2008 and then Aidan Fennessy.
But his role wasn't exclusively to be a literary manager.
Yeah, it started that way, and then he was directing more and more, but I still think he was the literary manager.
Well, Chris is allowed to direct. He's just working with playwrights.
Back to the question you had at the very beginning, what do we inherit when we take over these companies? And I say that we inherit a place in the ecology, you know, and a history in that ecology. And so that what we are often doing is saying, sure, I want to do all Indigenous theatre all the time, all over the country, make it all happen, let's go. But I also have inherited a world where, you know, I love white people are lovely. We love them, we like you to come, it's beautiful. And so there's an open invitation for every white person to come to Queensland Theatre Company. So we don't want to exclude you in any way, shape or form. So that sense of saying that what I've inherited is not just my cultural background and my artistic background and what I've driven, but also the place in the ecology for that company. So, you know, we're talking about independent theatre before, we're talking about, you know, the theatre that's really on the edge. And I know in the room here is Liz Bircham from Metro, and I know Reese from LeBoit's in the room. And, you know, one of the things that we've done at Queensland Theatre Company is go, what can we do that's unique? We can offer a large-scale theatre experience We've moved out of the smaller theatres, or we're trying to do some more, and go into the Playhouse, which is a huge risk profile for us. And it's not always paying off, but we say that's what we can offer. And those smaller companies are getting into the Cremorne, getting to the other theatres that are made available, and we're starting to see them grow. So if we kind of see ourselves playing a role in the ecology as opposed to being the ecology, we can kind of create pathways too.
It seems to me, Wesley, that has been not only a requirement in terms of contracts with state and federal funding bodies for some time, but actually willfully embraced and articulated in really quite effective ways. You may not think that scouring the websites of our major performing arts companies over the weekend would bring you an enormous amount of pleasure in terms of the About Us section, not the programs, which are always thrilling. But actually, I was really quite moved to read the vision statements and the histories of the companies. And coming to you, Polly, with the Sydney Theatre Company, it's part of the vision is beyond its creative ambitions as an artistic entity, the company is also mindful of its place as a leading Australian arts organisation. Our position and scale challenge us to promote the place of art in Australian society through advocacy and the activation of our networks. So challenge us to promote. It's a very, very dynamic phrase. We provide experiences to audiences, but we also want to help build ongoing artistic capacity among the individuals and communities with which we interact. We play a part in making a creative, forward-thinking and sociable future by engaging with young people, students and teachers. And we also celebrate and explore the traditional role of theatre as a place for the discussion of the great ideas of the day. I think that is a very genuine and sincere response. Holly.
So as part of that, we talk about, is this on? Theatre Without Borders, which I think sort of rips off Medicine Sans Frontières a little bit, but that idea is about not just kind of bringing in, but also reaching out. And when Kate and Andrew started the company, they talked a lot about wanting to open up the building. And so they sought to create collaborations with smaller companies and interstate companies, bring in shows from overseas, but also to go out into the community and do things that would reach out in different ways. So we have a community department that go and do shows with kids in Bankstown, and we do all kinds of work like that. So really I think that what they feel a state theatre company should do is have a huge breadth of what it offers. And it should offer small scale work, but also large scale work.
How does that vision, when it's manifest, affect I'm not sure if you would feel comfortable talking about the structure, but certainly the aesthetic of the work, like the processes for making work and the aesthetic that's aspired to. How does that vision impact on the actual practice?
Well, I think that's quite an interesting question, because in some ways I think that Andrew's thinking about it has evolved over the time that he's been at the company. And in the initial period, I think perhaps our programme was maybe a bit chaotic, because we did offer everything. And it's interesting to hear Wesley sort of talk then a little bit about, are we sort of festivals or presenters? And I think STC, maybe, I think it was a great endeavour to kind of get into bed with everyone. But I think now there's a sort of sense that maybe it's time to consolidate a little bit.
Somebody's feet always get cold.
But maybe it's also important to consolidate. And that maybe that was a little sort of maybe we were trying to do too much, and that maybe coming back in is a useful thing to do, and to consolidate on all of those relationships we build. And one of the things that Andrew's done is appoint resident directors. So Wesley, you were talking about that a little bit, that sense of key artists. And that we can start to build a sense of a bit more of an STC style, rather than us so we start to feel like a theatre company rather than a presenter.
Matt, your experience with Malthouse, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I joined Marion, so there was a unique situation where, Marion inherited a company under Stephen and Michael that had already done a massive U-turn, obviously, when it went from Playbox into Malthouse. And Marion's sort of vision that my role became about supporting and engaging with was just continuing that conversation and that multidisciplinary conversation, I guess. One of the things that's always been at the heart of Malthouse is that I guess it's about being in the engine room for ideas. The discussion like this morning and some of the discussions yesterday were very inspiring to think that how you can get a group of people in the room to talk about ideas before you start talking about the theatre, before you start talking about the form, but to have a conversation that, it's about time, really. It's about money, often, but trying to resource that. So then the project, theatre starts to come being created by a team of people, a team of artists. So I guess in some ways we're responding to the structure that so often happens of a play arriving and then a team of people producing that play, but as opposed to trying to get in there earlier. So it was about the development process. But also the thing that I find very inspiring about working at Malthouse at the moment is the idea of continuing that, I guess. That project can be initiated by any artist from any different art form. So, that's the ambition. Whether it's succeeding, I don't know.
How has it affected your practice? Because you were doing work with Malthouse, both as a co-producer with your company Thin Ice from WA, and then as a guest artist, directing for the main stage. Now as an artist embedded in the company, how has that actually affected your practice?
In some ways it's been it's a constant support and liberating, and other times it feels restricting and it feels like you have to, what it does is means you start to, you're given permission to endlessly dream and endlessly create projects, and you're given sort of time and resources to be able to do that, but you're also wearing other responsibilities all of a sudden. That suddenly your responsibilities are, for example, to the vision that Marion is creating, there's a responsibility to audience, there's a responsibility to the structure of the way the company's created, and I don't have a way to change that company structure. So it's sort of a process of being aware, suddenly feeling like you're being liberated, given great time, and you feel like very humbled to make the most of that. But,
if you were Marion for a moment, what would be the structural elements that you would want to change to make it possible to do things that you feel frustrated by?
Sure, the things that I would love to do.
I don't think you should be talking about undermining an artistic director and their vision, and I think that she should be here to speak about that. I don't think an associate should be saying that in public forum.
Thank you, Wesley. Then perhaps I could rephrase the question, Matt. Were you to be the artistic director of a company such as? I'm not Marion at all. I'm saying that there are the experiences that you have as an associate director, because you don't have to take responsibility for the whole. But what Matt do you imagine you would create for yourself if you? I don't think that is undermining. Well, I apologise to Marion if it's read into why I certainly didn't mean it. So we'll skip that question.
Sure. I think it would be good to skip the question. I'm just trying to respond also to what Wesley's saying. It's something about I know there is this. I know it sounds very wanky, but it's sort of like the responsibility to constantly be rigorous and sort of engage with your own work, and that's what I can offer Marion. Like it's constantly about,
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking more structurally about how one actually owns and uses resources, but I don't want to go there. Brenna, hi. When I was reading your website, Ralph wrote a really beautiful message to potential subscribers and audiences introducing his 2013 season, and he talks about our job as theatre makers is to make it as pleasurable a night as we can, and then goes on to apologise if it didn't work out, which is beautiful, the permission to fail in creating pleasure. Would you like to talk about, you've made some really fundamental structural changes in your company, both in terms of artistic personnel, also in how you've used your spaces. This is the conversation that I was wanting to open up in a free way before. Would you like to actually talk about that?
Sure. Look, the thing that was really interesting for us when Neil decided to leave is that we had an artistic director who was still creating incredibly good work. He still is, Secret River for Sydney Theatre Company this year was an amazing work. So in a way, Neil was still at the height of his powers. So what we knew is that we had to change or things would go terribly wrong, and that's part of what informed hiring an artistic director who was primarily a set designer and who has wound up directing, but certainly came in with a brief that he wouldn't necessarily. And so Ralph came in with the ability to create change potentially, and create change quickly, potentially in a way that is slightly more constrained for both Geordie and Wesley, I suspect. And so he came in and said straight away that he wanted to change the way we create work in the downstairs theatre. He wanted to make sure that every artist who walked into the building, and indeed every person who walked into the building, was paid. And so we stopped hosting independent companies and started producing our own work. And that meant that we had to cut down on the amount of works that we could produce, because producing in a small space is incredibly expensive. And as a result, so that was about opening up to a broader amount of artists. As part of that, we also appointed a whole lot of full-time artists to work with the company, both in literary spheres, and also we're about to go from 1 to 2 resident directors, but we never had a full-time resident director before. We'd had associate artistic directors before in the company. And so for us, that structural change was incredibly important, because it was part of the way that you reinvent the artistic vision when we had an artistic vision that was still working really well. The interesting thing in terms of Ralph's vision is that he's always just said that he wants to make good theatre. And it sounds like a really pat statement, but what it does is it makes you almost ultimately set yourself up to fail, because it's incredibly hard to do. You also take away any shackles of my theatre is going to be like X. So it means that you can create formally challenging theatre. It means that you can put on well-made plays. It means that you can engage with any artist that you think is exciting. And I think for us that has been a really liberating thing as well.
Indeed. Peter, your company collaborates with a long-deceased but incredibly inspiring and still alive personality and muse, I guess, in Shakespeare, and yet you have programmed works not written by Shakespeare. You've investigated through the ideas of Shakespeare with contemporary theatre practitioners. Would you like to just talk further about that ambition?
Yeah, so unlike a lot of my colleagues up here, I'm not the sole artistic director, but I share it. John Bell, who you'll know, is very much alive, and has only just stopped performing at the age of 72 in Henry IV, and then the next day started directing Tosca for AO, if I had half his energy. But when he invited me to join him, I suppose we shared a lot of the same values, and I've had an association with the company since 1997. I actually did the first regional tour, which is now called a national tour, and a lot of our regional partners I know are here at the conference, which is kind of the backbone of the company really, because John started it a lot to do with access. And I think the company's matured beyond that, but there is still a desire to reach as far as we possibly can. And so one of the things that we've done, particularly in the last 3 years, is try and make work out of other cities. That we've always engaged artists from out of Sydney, but primarily we've still been a Sydney-based company. So the last 3 years we've made 3 shows out of Melbourne, and we're currently making a work in Adelaide with Geordie's company. This we obviously think is incredibly important, to not just be a touring company, but to be a national company. But the thing that's changed in 23 years is that a lot more people are doing Shakespeare, and a lot more people are doing classics. And so I think that brief's changed a little bit for us, and we need to look at all the companies, and with all the people in this panel, and many who aren't, we have a responsibility to talk and see what other people are doing. And so that's what's really, the last few years we've been working with non-Shakespeare. And that's not easy. A lot of our audience want us just to do Shakespeare, but I really want to broaden our repertoire. And the other thing that it lets us do is engage other artists. I think a few years ago, and my ex-colleague Chris Tour would know about this, that in our budget line we didn't really have a thing for royalties. So that's a problem. We didn't need to worry about.
Still charged them though. Sorry, just to point out.
But we're wondering, my interest is obviously with writers, and so I wanted to engage more writers. And so we had writers on Duchess of Malfi, and we had Justin Fleming on the Molière. And, I'm trying to engage dramaturgs on all our Shakespeares that are either writers or directors, to try and expand it, because we are a company founded on the back of a writer, and I think that the inspiration that can do is huge. And then obviously our Mind's Eye program has developed more and more into commissioning. And the big challenge for me and my colleague Jill Perkins, the producer, is now we're trying to produce for the first time. And that's about partnerships. We don't have a venue, and so we're commissioning and talking to lots of people in this room actually about getting into more partnerships to produce more work that is inspired by Shakespeare and some of his inspirations, but we want to make more and more new work also.
Peter, I can feel Polly wanting to have a conversation with you.
I'm sort of interested this is to everyone really. Do we think that perhaps there's been a bit of, I'm not sort of now, that as the companies start to dabble in each other's, dip their toes in each other's waters, that there's a sort of a risk of a kind of flattening out. So, you know, Bell starts to do new work, Griffin starts to do classics, Tamarama Rock Surfers start to do Williamson, that we're sort of maybe going to enter are we at risk, do you think, of entering a kind of, or, you know, even STC starts to kind of partner with small companies that do we become a presenter? Is there a kind of flattening that we're at risk of, do you think? Wesley,
It goes back to the idea of what's the unique offering. What is it that that particular company can offer that's unique in the ecology? So I know in Brisbane we've had this analysis which goes, the physical theatre is incredibly strong. The number of physical theatre ensembles in Brisbane is in numbers in the dozens, be it circus, dance, other performance. And also classics. We have a number of Shakespeare ensembles in Brisbane, so we're going back to producing, you know, Shakespeare because it's a reflection of our community. And ultimately, isn't it that sense of saying, as any company, any artist, our job, our purpose is to reflect or magnify or go back to the community and have that connection and to be open to that. So that's about what's unique about what we can offer, not look, they're doing really well, let's go over there and grab that territory so we can grab their audience and bring them to us, which is sometimes what happens.
I think as well. Sorry, I think as well that it's every company's place in the ecology is different, and I mean Peter and I are going to be speaking from a different place to other theatre companies on the panel, and mine's probably from the same place that we don't. Our companies don't have a venue, and operating without a venue it's a very different kettle of fish to operating with, you know, so the way of crafting, if we want to call it unique experience or authenticity of experience or any of those kind of buzz phrases, they're completely different challenges, and that's because we take different places in the ecology, and you know, I mean, I think that's diversity, isn't it? That we can all engage in as many different types of work as we want, but ultimately we need to come together to present a very, very diverse range of things.
And also respond to what it is that artists want to do, and the calibre of opportunity that is possible in your companies is hopefully the best that we can offer, which isn't necessarily always going to be the most appropriate offer to an artist and what they want to do. Working for a major performing arts company is not a ubiquitous ambition, and there are many forms of practice where it simply wouldn't fit, but where it does, and there is a natural reach of artistic empathy or aesthetic, or in fact wanting to unlock empathy through artistic experience, then why would we limit ourselves, would be the question that I would ask. Mike, how is it for you in the world of circus?
How is it in the world of circus? One thing I just responded to Wesley was that saying we were all freelance artists. I was definitely a poor artist, but I don't actually recall a time when I would consider myself a freelance artist. And I came through a theatre course in Bathurst that pretty much put us into collectives and teams from literally the first week we arrived. Fraser Caulfield, Kath Melbourne, Julian Louis all came through the similar course, and we were never sent out into the world to sort of fight as solo performers or solo artists. So, and by that I'm sort of answering the question, is that in my DNA, my theatrical DNA is the notion of a collective, and that collective comes with a set of values of watching each other's back and using each other's strengths and supporting each other when you know, it may not be an all-star collective, but you're looking after the weakest member of the collective, or whatever it is. It's a set of values that come from the beginning. And that was in my DNA. I looked to Circus Oz, at least in the early years of Circus Oz, which was a collective of about 30 people, as a structure that I aspired to. And it was a tribal structure, it was a family structure, it was a notion of that's the group that your best partner is the person who's on the stage with you, or the person who's holding the rope on the other end of the trapeze. Regardless of whether you might know of someone who's a bit better at trapeze and they're not working for us at the moment and maybe we can cast them in the next show. No, your best partner is the one who's actually hanging on to the end of the rope right now. And that's a metaphor and a reality. So the idea of the collective is central to me and it's central to the company. We have it's slightly even more complex than the Bell structure. We have 3 CEOs. There's myself, there's Tim Caldwell, who's a 35-year founding member of the company, and our new general manager, Lou Oppenheim, who's just joined us from the MSO. After Linda Mickelborough's incredible time of 26 years in the company. So we are a collective of 3 in the executive team, and people from other companies often go, how do you do that? 3 CEOs, how do you make decisions? And for us, it's a damn sight easier than 30 people making decisions. So it's a reduced collective, but it's still a collective, and it's actually really easy, and we come up with robust decisions. The way that we think about the company, or one way to think about the company is a gang of pirates on a ship, and we actually are a gang of pirates, and we actually have a ship. The ship's kind of like our circus tent. We've been playing pretty straight for the last few years, but the federal government is now building us this brand new building in the centre of Collingwood that will be our home base. Tim Caldwell, as a founding member of the company, is actually designing the building as we speak. He's spent the last 2 years going over plans, and so the DNA of the founders of the company is going to be in the bricks and mortar. It may be a millstone around our neck, we don't know, but we're doing every fucking thing we can to avoid that. There's room for it. There's a Spiegel tent which we bought, which will be on the site. There's room for caravans to be parked, for people to live in the caravans so that itinerant mob can swing through and stay with us. There's a potential incredible connection with the local Indigenous community in Collingwood. There's a whole lot of great things about that building, and I think we have been playing straight till we've got it. And the analogy that I use is literally a ship tacking towards utopia, and the utopia is defined by the aspirations of the pirates who happen to be on the ship at the time. So that's it over there. It's sort of blurry, but there is a light on the horizon, and often we have to tack almost at 90 degrees to the wind to get in that direction, and the building has been one tack and a full-time ensemble were previous tacks. And it is about who's on the ship, and if they're on the ship they get a bit of a say, and if they've been on the ship for a long time they get more of a say, and if they've been on there from the beginning they get a huge amount of say. And my job as artistic director is to work with all of those people on the ship and to help them, you know, not sink, basically.